The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashworth Manor, casting golden rays across the marble floors that Lady Eleanor Sinclair had spent weeks perfecting for today's grand celebration. Every detail of the Duke of Pemberton's wedding had been meticulously planned under her expert guidance, from the cascading arrangements of white roses and jasmine that adorned every surface to the precisely choreographed movements of the household staff she had trained personally. Eleanor adjusted her deep burgundy silk gown, the color chosen deliberately to complement but never compete with the bride's ivory magnificence. As the premier wedding coordinator for England's most distinguished families, she had built her reputation on creating flawless celebrations that would be remembered for generations. Today's union between the Duke of Pemberton and Lady Margaret Ashworth promised to be her masterpiece. The mansion buzzed with controlled activity as Eleanor moved through the rooms like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. In the grand ballroom, footmen positioned the final chairs while maids polished crystal glasses until they sparkled like diamonds. The kitchen hummed with the preparation of delicacies that would grace tables groaning under the weight of culinary perfection. Everything was proceeding exactly as Eleanor had envisioned during months of careful planning. "Miss Eleanor," called Sarah, one of the younger maids, her voice carrying a note of urgency as she hurried across the marble foyer. The girl's blonde curls had escaped from beneath her pristine white cap, and her cheeks were flushed from exertion. "The flowers for the Duchess's sitting-room, they've not arrived yet, and Lady Margaret specifically requested white peonies for her private preparations." Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of concern that accompanied any deviation from her carefully laid plans, but her expression remained serene. She had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of perfection, and today's celebration would tolerate no imperfections. "Send word to Thornberry's immediately," she instructed, her voice calm and authoritative. "Tell them we require the peonies within the hour, or we shall be forced to seek alternative arrangements." The maid bobbed a quick curtsy and scurried away, leaving Eleanor to continue her inspection of the preparations. She made her way through the corridors, noting with satisfaction how the morning light caught the silver candelabras and highlighted the fresh greenery she had personally selected from the manor's gardens. The Duke of Pemberton had spared no expense, and Eleanor had ensured that every pound was invested in creating an atmosphere of unparalleled elegance. As she climbed the grand staircase toward the family quarters, Eleanor reflected on the curious circumstances that had led to today's celebration. The Duke of Pemberton, Alexander Whitmore, was considered one of England's most eligible bachelors, a man of 30 years whose dark hair and penetrating blue eyes had been the subject of countless romantic fantasies among the ton's unmarried ladies. His engagement to Lady Margaret had been announced with great fanfare, though Eleanor had noticed a certain coolness between the couple during her meetings with them. Lady Margaret was undeniably beautiful, with her golden hair and porcelain complexion, but there was something calculating in her green eyes that Eleanor found unsettling. During their planning sessions, the bride-to-be had shown more interest in the social prominence the wedding would bring than in any romantic sentiment. Still, Eleanor reminded herself, marriages among the aristocracy were often matters of practical alliance rather than passionate love, and it was not her place to question the arrangements made by England's noble families. The sound of masculine voices drew Eleanor's attention as she reached the second floor. Through a partially open door, she glimpsed the Duke of Pemberton in conversation with several gentlemen who had arrived early for the ceremony. Alexander Whitmore commanded attention wherever he went, his tall frame and aristocratic bearing making him a natural leader among his peers. Eleanor had worked with many titled gentlemen over the years, but something about the Duke's presence seemed to affect her in ways she found both troubling and inexplicable. During their planning meetings, she had found herself stealing glances at his strong hands as he reviewed contracts, admiring the way his dark hair caught the light when he leaned forward to examine floral arrangements. His voice, deep and resonant with the cultured accent of his class, seemed to resonate through her entire being when he spoke directly to her. These reactions were entirely inappropriate for a woman in her position, and Eleanor had worked diligently to maintain her professional composure despite the unexpected attraction she felt toward her client. "The ceremony shall commence at precisely 2 o'clock, she heard the Duke explaining to his guests. "Lady Eleanor has orchestrated every detail to perfection. I have complete confidence in her abilities." The warmth in his voice when he spoke her name sent an unwelcome thrill through Eleanor's chest. She quickened her pace, determined to focus on the practical matters that required her attention rather than dwelling on feelings that could never be acknowledged, much less acted upon. The gulf between her position as a working woman, however successful, and his status as one of England's premier dukes was insurmountable. In the bride's preparation chamber, Lady Margaret sat before an ornate mirror while her personal maid arranged her golden hair in an elaborate style that would perfectly complement the family tiara she would wear. The bride's ivory silk gown, adorned with Brussels lace and tiny pearls, lay carefully spread across the bed like a work of art. Eleanor had overseen every aspect of its creation, ensuring that Lady Margaret would be the epitome of bridal perfection. "Eleanor, darling," Lady Margaret called without turning from her reflection. "I trust everything is proceeding according to schedule? I simply cannot tolerate any delays or disruptions on my wedding day." "Everything is exactly as planned, my lady," Eleanor assured her, though she made a mental note to check on the peony situation. "The guests are beginning to arrive, and the Duke appears quite eager for the ceremony to begin." Lady Margaret's reflection smiled with what might have been satisfaction rather than joy. "Of course he is. This union will benefit both our families tremendously. Father says the Duke's properties in Yorkshire will complement our holdings beautifully." Eleanor managed to maintain her pleasant expression while privately noting that most brides might mention love or happiness rather than property arrangements when discussing their wedding day. Still, she had learned not to judge the ways of the aristocracy, whose marriages often served purposes beyond personal fulfillment. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Eleanor found herself moving through the manor with increasing efficiency, addressing small crises and ensuring that every element of the celebration proceeded flawlessly. The guests began arriving in greater numbers, lords and ladies in their finest attire, creating a sea of silk, velvet, and jewels that transformed the manor into a glittering showcase of English high society. The Duke appeared at various points throughout the preparations, always impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite to everyone he encountered. Eleanor noticed how he spoke kindly to the servants, remembered their names, and expressed genuine gratitude for their efforts. This consideration for those below his station struck her as unusual among the aristocracy and only served to deepen the inappropriate feelings she was struggling to suppress. "Miss Eleanor," came a soft voice behind her as she supervised the final placement of floral arrangements in the main corridor. She turned to find Sarah, the blonde maid who had inquired about the peonies earlier. The girl looked nervous, twisting her hands in her white apron. "The peonies arrived safely, I trust?" Eleanor inquired, noting that the young woman seemed unusually agitated. "Yes, miss, they're beautiful. But there's something else." Sarah glanced around nervously before continuing in a whisper. "I was taking fresh linens to the Duke's chambers, and I heard. That is, I couldn't help but overhear." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor felt a prickle of concern. In her experience, servants' gossip could sometimes reveal important information about the families they served, and today's celebration could not afford any surprises. "What did you hear, Sarah? You may speak freely." The maid's cheeks flushed an even deeper pink. The Duke was speaking with someone, a gentleman caller who arrived earlier. They were discussing. That is, the Duke said something about obligations and duty, and how sometimes a man must sacrifice his own desires for the good of his family name. Eleanor frowned, unsure what to make of this information. Perhaps he was simply reflecting on the responsibilities of marriage. Many bridegrooms experience some nervousness before their wedding day. Sarah nodded quickly, but Eleanor could see there was more the girl wanted to say. However, before she could encourage further confidence, the sound of carriages arriving drew their attention to the front entrance, where more distinguished guests were making their grand arrivals. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a whirlwind of activity as Eleanor ensured that every guest was properly received, every refreshment perfectly presented, and every detail of the ceremony preparation completed to her exacting standards. The Duke and Lady Margaret took their places as the clock approached 2, both looking magnificent in their wedding attire. Eleanor positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining ready to address any unexpected issues. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of Anglican tradition, with the Archbishop of Canterbury himself officiating. Lady Margaret looked radiant in her ivory silk and family lace, while the Duke appeared every inch the perfect bridegroom in his formal morning dress. Yet as Eleanor watched the couple exchange vows, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The Duke's responses were correct and properly delivered, but there was no warmth in his eyes as he looked at his bride. Lady Margaret's expression was one of satisfaction rather than joy, as though she were completing a particularly advantageous business transaction rather than beginning a life with the man she loved. Eleanor chided herself for these observations. She was a wedding coordinator, not a romantic novelist, and her responsibility was to ensure the smooth execution of the celebration, not to judge the emotional authenticity of the participants. Still, the contrast between this ceremony and others she had organized was striking. She had witnessed unions where the couple could barely contain their joy, where stolen glances and suppressed smiles spoke of genuine affection and eager anticipation for their shared future. As the newly married couple processed down the aisle to the sounds of triumphant organ music, Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sadness. The Duke, now properly addressed as Your Grace along with his new Duchess, deserved more than a marriage of convenience, regardless of how advantageous the union might be for both families involved. The wedding breakfast that followed was a testament to Eleanor's organizational skills and attention to detail. The guests were seated according to her carefully crafted arrangement, ensuring that conversations flowed smoothly and that no social faux pas disrupted the celebration. The menu she had planned with the manor's head cook was met with universal approval, from the delicate salmon mousse to the magnificent wedding cake that rose in elaborate tiers adorned with sugar flowers. During the festivities, Eleanor moved discreetly among the guests, ensuring that wine glasses remained filled, that elderly relatives were comfortable, and that the younger members of the party found appropriate entertainment. She took pride in her ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to solve problems before they became apparent to anyone but herself. It was during this careful supervision that she noticed the Duke stepping away from the main celebration. As the host, his temporary absence might be noted by the guests, so Eleanor followed at a discreet distance to ensure that nothing was amiss. Perhaps he needed a moment of quiet after the intensive socializing, or required assistance with some detail of hospitality that had escaped her attention. She tracked his movement through the manor's corridors, past family portraits that gazed down with the accumulated dignity of centuries. The Duke's destination appeared to be the library, a room Eleanor had ensured was prepared with fresh flowers and perfectly arranged furniture in case any guests desired a quieter environment for conversation. As she approached the library door, which stood slightly ajar, Eleanor heard voices from within, the Duke's familiar deep tones and a softer voice she couldn't immediately identify. Her professional instincts told her to announce her presence, but something in the intimate quality of their conversation made her hesitate. "I cannot continue this charade any longer," she heard the Duke saying, his voice heavy with emotion she had never heard from him before. "Today has been torture, standing there speaking vows I do not feel, promising a future I do not want." Eleanor's heart began to race as the implications of his words sank in. She knew she should retreat immediately, that whatever conversation was taking place was not meant for her ears, but her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. "Your Grace, you know it's impossible," came the soft reply, and Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the voice of Sarah, the blonde maid who had seemed so nervous earlier. "You have duties, obligations. Today you've married Lady Margaret, and that must be the end of it." "Must it?" The Duke's voice was filled with anguish. "Must I spend the rest of my life pretending to feel for my wife what I feel for you? Must I lie beside her every night knowing that my heart belongs to someone else entirely?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full meaning of the conversation became clear. The Duke of Pemberton, on his wedding day, was declaring his love for a servant, the very maid who had been helping Eleanor with the preparations all morning. "Alexander, please," Sarah whispered, and the intimacy of her using his given name spoke of a relationship that had clearly existed long before today's ceremony. "You know this can never be. I'm grateful for your kindness, for the way you've treated me with respect when others see only a servant, but we live in different worlds." "Different worlds be damned," the Duke replied with a passion that Eleanor had never heard him express about anything. "I care nothing for society's expectations or the differences in our stations. I love you, Sarah. I have loved you since the day you arrived at this house, and I cannot pretend otherwise any longer." Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the corridor. She felt as though she were witnessing the collapse of everything she had worked to create, yet she could not bring herself to move away. "You married Lady Margaret because it was expected of you," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "Because your family needed the alliance, because society demanded it. Those reasons haven't changed simply because the ceremony is over." "Haven't they?" There was the sound of movement from within the room, and Eleanor realized with shock that she was witnessing something far more intimate than a mere conversation. Through the crack in the door, she could see the Duke's tall form moving closer to the slight figure in the maid's uniform. What happened next would be forever burned into Eleanor's memory. The Duke of Pemberton, still wearing his formal wedding attire, took the blonde servant girl into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left no doubt about the sincerity of his feelings. It was not the chaste peck of politeness or the calculated display of affection she had witnessed during his wedding ceremony, but the desperate embrace of a man kissing the woman he truly loved. Sarah initially resisted, her small hands pressing against his chest as though to push him away, but the Duke's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer until her resistance crumbled. Eleanor watched in fascination and horror as the maid's arms moved up to circle the Duke's neck, her fingers threading through his dark hair as she returned his kiss with equal fervor. "I cannot give you up," the Duke whispered against Sarah's lips, his voice breaking with emotion. "Not today, not ever. I know what society expects, what my position demands, but my heart recognizes no such restrictions." "Alexander, my love," Sarah breathed, and Eleanor could hear the tears in her voice. "What we feel for each other doesn't change the reality of our situations. You are now a married man, and I am still a servant in your household. Nothing good can come of this." Eleanor knew she should flee immediately, should pretend she had never witnessed this scene, but she found herself frozen in place. The raw emotion she was observing stood in stark contrast to the cold formality of the wedding ceremony she had orchestrated. Here was genuine love, authentic passion, real feeling, everything that had been absent from the carefully choreographed celebration taking place just rooms away. "Then let me change our reality," the Duke said, his hands cradling Sarah's face with infinite tenderness. "Come away with me. We'll leave England, travel to America or the continent where no one knows us, where we can build a life together based on love rather than obligation." Sarah's tear-filled eyes reflected both longing and impossibility. "And abandon your responsibilities? Your estates, your tenants who depend on you, your new wife? Alexander, you know you could never live with yourself if you simply disappeared. Your sense of honor wouldn't allow it." The Duke's shoulders sagged as the truth of her words sank in. Eleanor could see the battle raging within him, between his desires and his duties, between his heart and his obligations. It was a conflict that countless members of the aristocracy had faced throughout history, and one that rarely ended in favor of love. "Then what would you have me do?" he asked, his voice hollow with despair. "Pretend that this feeling doesn't exist? Spend the rest of my life playing the role of devoted husband while my heart belongs to you?" "Perhaps," Sarah said softly, "that is exactly what you must do. For both our sakes." Eleanor felt tears stinging her own eyes as she witnessed the tragedy unfolding before her. She had spent her career creating perfect weddings, but she had never before been confronted so starkly with the difference between a perfect ceremony and a perfect marriage. The celebration she had orchestrated would be remembered as flawless, but the union itself was built on a foundation of duty rather than love. The sound of footsteps in the corridor behind her suddenly broke through Eleanor's emotional paralysis. Someone was approaching, and if she were discovered eavesdropping on such a private and potentially scandalous scene, it could ruin not only her reputation but create a catastrophe for everyone involved. Moving as quietly as possible, Eleanor retreated from the library door and made her way swiftly back toward the main celebration. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she had witnessed and what it might mean for the future. The Duke's marriage to Lady Margaret was now a legal fact, regardless of his feelings for Sarah, and any continuation of his relationship with the maid could destroy both their lives. As she re-entered the ballroom, Eleanor was struck by the contrast between the glittering celebration and the heartbreak she had just witnessed. Lady Margaret, now the Duchess of Pemberton, was holding court among the female guests, displaying her wedding ring and accepting congratulations with evident satisfaction. The guests continued their celebrations, completely unaware of the drama that had been unfolding just rooms away. Eleanor forced herself to resume her professional duties, checking that the staff was maintaining proper service, ensuring that elderly guests were comfortable, and overseeing the gradual transition from the wedding breakfast to the evening festivities. Yet her mind kept returning to the scene in the library, to the raw emotion in the Duke's voice and the tears in Sarah's eyes. Over the following hours, Eleanor found herself watching both the Duke and Sarah with new understanding. The Duke returned to the celebration and performed his role as bridegroom with perfect correctness, but Eleanor could now see the subtle signs of strain around his eyes, the way his smile never quite reached them. When he looked at his new bride, his expression was pleasant but distant, as though he were observing her from a great remove. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her duties with her usual efficiency, but Eleanor noticed how the girl carefully avoided looking in the Duke's direction. When their paths crossed during the service of the meal, both maintained perfect propriety, giving no sign of the scene that had transpired between them. Yet Eleanor could see the tension in Sarah's movements, the way her hands trembled slightly as she served the wine. As evening approached and the celebration reached its crescendo, Eleanor found herself contemplating the impossible situation she had inadvertently discovered. The Duke was trapped in a marriage that would provide social and financial benefits but no emotional fulfillment, while Sarah was caught between her love for a man she could never have and her need to maintain her position in his household. The tragedy of their situation was compounded by Eleanor's recognition that both were fundamentally good people caught in circumstances beyond their control. The Duke, despite his privileged position, was clearly a man of genuine feeling and consideration for others. Sarah, despite her humble origins, possessed a dignity and strength that commanded respect. Eleanor's professional success had been built on her ability to create perfect celebrations for England's most distinguished families, but she had never before been confronted with the human cost of the social expectations that governed their lives. The perfect wedding she had orchestrated was also a perfect prison for everyone involved. As the evening wore on, Eleanor noticed that the Duke and Sarah continued to avoid each other with careful precision. Their behavior was so studiously correct that anyone observing closely might wonder if their very avoidance suggested something that needed to be avoided. Yet the other guests, focused on their own enjoyment and conversations, seemed oblivious to any undercurrents. Lady Margaret, now the Duchess, appeared entirely satisfied with her new position. She moved through the celebration like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations and admiring comments about the wedding arrangements. When she spoke of her future plans, it was always in terms of the social advancement and material benefits her marriage would bring, never with any reference to personal happiness or affection for her new husband. Eleanor began to understand that Lady Margaret was as much a participant in this marriage of convenience as the Duke himself. Perhaps she too had sacrificed personal desires for family expectations and social advancement. The difference was that Lady Margaret seemed content with the arrangement, while the Duke was clearly struggling with his emotional compromises. As the celebration moved into its final phase, with the younger guests preparing for dancing and the older ones settling into comfortable conversations over port and brandy, Eleanor realized that her role in this particular story was drawing to a close. By tomorrow, the wedding party would disperse, the Duke and Duchess would begin their married life, and Sarah would continue her duties as a servant in their household. Yet Eleanor could not shake the feeling that the story was far from over. The love she had witnessed between the Duke and Sarah was too powerful to simply disappear because society demanded it. Such feelings, suppressed but not destroyed, had a way of finding expression that could prove dangerous for everyone involved. The thought troubled Eleanor as she supervised the final details of the celebration. She had built her career on creating perfect weddings, but perfection in ceremony was clearly no guarantee of perfection in marriage. The beautiful celebration she had orchestrated concealed a web of complicated emotions and impossible desires that could easily lead to scandal and heartbreak. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to take their leave, Eleanor found herself observing the newly married couple with new eyes. The Duke and Duchess performed their farewell duties with perfect courtesy, thanking guests for their attendance and expressing appreciation for their wedding gifts. To all outward appearances, they were the ideal aristocratic couple beginning their married life with every advantage. Yet Eleanor could see the subtle signs of strain that others missed, the way the Duke's hand rested on his wife's arm with politeness rather than affection, the way the Duchess's smile was bright but never warm when she looked at her husband. Most telling of all was the way both their eyes would unconsciously search the room, though Eleanor suspected they were looking for very different things. The Duke, she realized, was looking for Sarah, though he was clearly fighting the impulse. The Duchess seemed to be cataloguing the social success of the event, mentally noting which important families had attended and how favorably impressed they appeared to be. Neither was looking at the other with anything resembling love or even genuine interest. As the last carriage departed and the manor began to settle into quiet, Eleanor oversaw the staff's efforts to restore order to the rooms that had hosted the celebration. The flowers that had looked so magnificent that morning now seemed slightly wilted, and the remains of the feast spoke of pleasures already past. There was always something melancholy about the aftermath of a great celebration, but tonight the feeling seemed more pronounced than usual. Eleanor was directing the careful packing of the remaining wedding cake when she noticed Sarah working alone in the library, returning the furniture to its usual arrangement. The girl moved mechanically, as though her thoughts were far from her task, and Eleanor could see the traces of tears on her cheeks. "Sarah," Eleanor called softly, causing the maid to start and turn toward her. "Are you quite well? You look tired." The girl attempted a smile, but it was clearly an effort. "I'm perfectly fine, Miss Eleanor. It's been a long day for all of us." Eleanor studied the young woman's face, seeing beyond the conventional response to the real pain beneath. "Perhaps you should retire early tonight. The other maids can finish the cleaning." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears at this small kindness. "You're very thoughtful, miss, but I'd prefer to keep busy. It helps me not to think about things that cannot be changed." The simple honesty of this response touched Eleanor deeply. Here was a young woman facing the loss of everything she held dear with dignity and courage, asking for nothing more than the opportunity to lose herself in work. It was a response that spoke of strength and character that many of Eleanor's aristocratic clients would do well to emulate. "Sarah," Eleanor said gently, "I want you to know that if you ever need anything, a reference for another position, perhaps, or simply someone to talk to, you may always come to me." The maid's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. "That's very kind of you, Miss Eleanor. I may need such help sooner than I expected." Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. "You're planning to leave Ashworth Manor?" Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I cannot stay, miss. Not now. It would be impossible for everyone involved." Eleanor's heart ached for the girl's situation. Sarah was choosing to sacrifice her position and security, rather than remain in a situation that would be painful for herself and potentially dangerous for the Duke. It was a decision that showed both wisdom and selflessness, but it would leave her with few options in a world that offered limited opportunities for women in her position. "Where will you go?" Eleanor asked, her professional mind already considering how she might help. "I have a sister in York who works as a seamstress," Sarah replied. She's written that her employer might have need of another skilled worker. It's not certain, but it's a possibility. Eleanor made a mental note to write a letter of recommendation that would ensure Sarah's employment, regardless of whether the York position materialized. The girl deserved every assistance Eleanor could provide, both as compensation for the pain she was enduring and in recognition of her courage in making such a difficult choice. As Sarah returned to her work and Eleanor continued her supervision of the cleaning, both women moved with the careful dignity of those who understood that some battles could not be won, only endured with grace. The perfect wedding Eleanor had created would be remembered as a social triumph, but the human cost of that triumph would remain hidden from all but a few witnesses. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Eleanor found herself thinking often of the Duke and Sarah, wondering how they were managing their impossible situation. She received occasional reports through the network of servants and suppliers that connected England's great houses, learning that the new Duchess was settling into her role with apparent satisfaction, while the Duke maintained his usual schedule of estate management and social obligations. There was no mention of Sarah in these reports, and Eleanor suspected that the girl had indeed left the Duke's household as she had planned. The thought brought Eleanor both relief and sadness. Relief that Sarah had escaped a situation that could only have brought her pain, sadness that true love had been sacrificed to the demands of social convention. Eleanor's own work continued with its usual success, as she coordinated celebrations for other distinguished families, but she found herself viewing these events with new awareness of the human complexities they might conceal. The perfect ceremonies she created were beautiful achievements, but they could not guarantee the happiness of the people at their center. Months passed, and Eleanor's reputation continued to grow as word of the Duke of Pemberton's flawless wedding spread through society. She received commissions from families throughout England, each seeking to replicate the elegance and precision she had demonstrated at Ashworth Manor. Yet even as her professional success reached new heights, Eleanor could not forget the scene she had witnessed in the library, or the tears in Sarah's eyes as she prepared to leave everything she knew for an uncertain future. It was nearly a year later when Eleanor encountered the Duke of Pemberton again, at a garden party she was coordinating for the Earl of Worthington. She saw him across the manicured lawns, still handsome and imposing in his formal attire, but there was something different about him, a shadow around his eyes that spoke of resignation rather than contentment. The Duchess was at his side, as beautiful as ever in a gown of pale yellow silk that perfectly complemented her golden hair. She moved through the social gathering with evident satisfaction, clearly enjoying her position as one of society's most prominent young wives. Yet Eleanor noticed that she and her husband rarely looked at each other, and when they did, their expressions were polite but distant. Eleanor was supervising the service of refreshments when the Duke approached her, his manner as courteous as ever, but his eyes holding a sadness that had not been there during their previous meetings. "Miss Eleanor," he said with a slight bow, "I trust you are well? I have heard many compliments regarding your work since the wedding at Ashworth Manor." "Your Grace is too kind," Eleanor replied, maintaining her professional composure despite the flood of memories his presence evoked. "I trust you and the Duchess are enjoying good health?" Something flickered in the Duke's eyes at this conventional inquiry. "We are both quite well, thank you. The Duchess has settled into her new role admirably, and the estate continues to prosper." The careful neutrality of his response told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the state of his marriage. He was fulfilling his duties as a husband and landowner, but there was no warmth or happiness in his description of his circumstances. "I'm pleased to hear it," Eleanor said, though her heart ached for the man standing before her. "And your household staff? Are they all well?" The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at this question, and Eleanor realized he understood exactly what she was asking. "Some changes were necessary," he said carefully. "One of the housemaids sought a position elsewhere, in York, I believe. I understand she has found suitable employment." Eleanor felt a wave of relief at this news. Sarah had successfully established herself in a new situation, away from the impossible circumstances at Ashworth Manor. It was the best possible outcome under the circumstances, though Eleanor suspected the separation had been difficult for both the Duke and Sarah. "I'm glad to hear of her success," Eleanor said simply, and saw understanding pass between them. They were both aware of the subtext of their conversation, but neither could acknowledge it directly. The Duke nodded, his eyes holding gratitude for her discretion and understanding. Indeed. Sometimes such changes, though difficult, prove to be for the best. Before Eleanor could respond, the Duchess approached them, her expression bright with social pleasure. "Alexander, darling, Lady Worthington has been asking about our plans for the autumn season. We simply must discuss our calendar." "Of course, my dear," the Duke replied, his manner toward his wife perfectly correct but lacking any trace of genuine affection. "Miss Eleanor, it has been a pleasure to see you again. I wish you continued success in your endeavors." As the Duke and Duchess moved away together, Eleanor watched them go with a mixture of admiration and sadness. The Duke was fulfilling his obligations with dignity and honor, sacrificing his personal happiness for duty and social expectation. It was a choice that countless members of his class had made throughout history, but that did not make it any less tragic for the individuals involved. Eleanor continued her work at the garden party, but her thoughts remained with the Duke and Sarah, two people whose love had been genuine and deep but ultimately impossible. Their story was a reminder that even perfect planning and flawless execution could not guarantee happiness, and that sometimes the most beautiful ceremonies concealed the most painful sacrifices. As the season progressed, Eleanor threw herself into her work with renewed dedication, creating celebrations that continued to set the standard for elegance and refinement among England's aristocratic families. Yet she carried with her the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of such gatherings, the complicated emotions, the impossible desires, and the quiet heroism of those who chose duty over personal fulfillment. The Duke of Pemberton's wedding had been Eleanor's masterpiece in terms of organizational achievement, but it had also been a profound education in the human complexities that no amount of planning could resolve. She had learned that true perfection in matters of the heart could not be orchestrated or arranged, and that sometimes the most courageous choice was to let love go rather than allow it to destroy everyone it touched. In quiet moments, Eleanor would wonder about Sarah's new life in York, hoping that the young woman had found peace and perhaps even happiness in her fresh start. She thought, too, of the Duke, carrying on his duties with stoic dignity while his heart remained elsewhere. Their sacrifice had preserved the social order that Eleanor's clients held dear, but the cost of that preservation was a reminder that perfection in ceremony was often purchased with imperfection in life. The lessons Eleanor learned from that perfect wedding would influence her work for years to come, adding depth and understanding to her interactions with the families she served. She would never again witness the exchange of wedding vows without remembering that the most beautiful ceremonies might conceal the most complex human stories, and that her role in creating perfect celebrations carried with it a responsibility to treat all involved with compassion and discretion. The Duke's wedding had been perfect in every visible detail, but Eleanor would never forget that perfection, like beauty, was often only skin-deep, and that the most important truths about human nature were frequently hidden behind the most elegant facades.